Okay, so what if a country's green energy goals could, accidentally spark a massive fuel crisis and at the same time hand another country a huge amount of global power? Well, that is the really provocative argument from the YouTube channel Vince Dow that we are breaking down today. And it all starts with a crisis that's unfolding right now in Australia. It all kicks off with this one number, over 500. According to the source, that is how many service stations all across Australia have recently run completely dry of at least one type of fuel. And look, this isn't just some minor inconvenience, it's a sign of a much, much bigger nationwide problem. So, what does a crisis of this size actually look and feel like on the ground for everyday Australians? The picture the source material paints is pretty chaotic. We're talking strict fuel rationing. You've got 50-liter limits, outright bans on filling up extra cans. The lines at the pump, they're apparently the longest anyone's seen since the 1979 oil crisis. And the cost? Wow. It is just skyrocketing. Unleaded petrol is pushing nearly $3 a liter, and a single fill-up for a large diesel tank can set you back as much as $240. So how on earth did a major developed nation get to this point? Well, the source argues this wasn't just some bit of bad luck. It was a crisis that was actually created by Australia's very own domestic policies. The source really frames its whole argument around this one direct quote. I also think this is a cautionary tale of woke, idiotic politics. So this sets up the central claim, right? The idea here is that, in the source's view, Australia's chase for aggressive climate goals came at the expense of its own energy security, and that is the real root cause of this whole crisis. And here it is, the core of that claim visualized. The source points out that over just the last several years, Australia's number of domestic oil refineries has just plummeted, from 8 all the way down to just 2. That is a massive collapse in the country's ability to produce its own fuel. And, the consequence of shutting down all those refineries is pretty clear. The video argues that Australia basically went from being an energy producer to a nation that is completely dependent on foreign imports. Its fuel supply chain now relies on oil coming from Asia, which, by the way, gets its oil from the Middle East, a notoriously volatile part of the world. So when that supply chain fails, where does a country like Australia turn? Well, according to the source, the answer to that question reveals this really dramatic shift in global power, one that puts the United States in a very, very influential position. So this lays out the source's step-by-step logic. It argues there's this chain reaction happening. It all starts when countries adopt net zero policies. That's the idea of balancing out greenhouse gas emissions. That leads them to shut down their own domestic energy production, which, of course, forces them to rely on imports. But then when that global supply chain inevitably hits a snag, they're left with just one last resort, turning to the USA for oil. And this, the source points out, is where the United States comes in as the world's single largest producer of oil and natural gas. That isn't just an economic fact. The argument is that this creates incredible geopolitical leverage, basically turning energy into this powerful tool of international influence. Then the source zooms out a bit, arguing this isn't just about Australia. It points over to Europe, which, after cutting ties with Russian energy, is now also becoming more and more dependent on American supply. So in this view, the climate policies of all these Western nations have kind of unintentionally handed America this massive competitive advantage on the world stage. And that brings us to the real core thesis of this source material, a very realist take on what truly holds together international alliances and relationships here in the 21st century. It really makes you ask a fundamental question, doesn't it? What truly holds alliances together? Is it shared values, or is it something way more practical? The source's answer is captured perfectly in this quote. Alliances are built on practical need, not on liberal values or democracy. So in this realist view of the world, controlling the energy that somebody else needs is a much more powerful bond than any shared political philosophy could ever be. So finally, the source turns the lens inward and asks, okay, what does this new role as the world's energy supplier actually mean for the United States itself? And this creates a real domestic dilemma, a true two-sided coin. On one side, you've got U.S. oil companies making record profits from exporting all this energy to their desperate allies. But you flip that point over, and you see that the same international demand is driving up prices right here at home. That means American consumers are paying more at the pump. As the source puts it, it's geopolitical gain versus domestic pain. So what's the solution to that dilemma? Well, the source proposes a couple of potential actions. The first one is a big one. Consider export controls. Basically, to keep more of that American oil right here at home, which could lower domestic prices. The second is to pressure the oil companies themselves to use some of their record profits to give direct price relief to people at the pump. And all of that leaves us with this final provocative question posed by the source material. It really captures the central tension of the entire argument. If America's oil has become its most powerful geopolitical tool, who is paying the price for that back home? It's a really complex question, right at the intersection of energy, policy, and power. Thanks for joining us to break it all down.